Partial funding for Thinking Aloud is provided by the Intuition Network, helping to create a world where people feel encouraged to rely upon their inner intuitive resources.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is meditative reason. With me is Professor Ashok Gangadine, who is chairman of the philosophy department at Haverford College in Haverford, Pennsylvania. Dr. Gangadine is also the director of the Global Dialogue Institute, and he is the author of several books, including Meditative Reason, Between Worlds, and Awakening of the Global Mind. Welcome, Ashok.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You seem to be a philosopher who is carrying the torch of Huston Smith and Aldous Huxley, who wrote about the primordial tradition or the perennial philosophy, which is to say that a recognition amongst the sages of many, many different traditions that they were, even though they used different language, speaking of a fundamental reality that underlies all philosophy, all culture, all linguistic and semantic expressions.
I think that's quite accurate. I think I am very much in that tradition, and all my career has been following the intuition that there must be a fundamental logos or principle underlying the diverse traditions of philosophy. But I think you said it right. I think the classical themes across cultures has been perennial also. So it is an ancient, long-standing tradition in philosophies.
And you use the term logos to identify that principle.
Yes, I selected logos. I found as a philosopher that as I was working through the different traditions, all the way through from the Greek classical tradition into contemporary European thought, and working in the Hindu tradition and in the Buddhist tradition, as well as in the Zen traditions, and having an interest in the different global traditions, I found so many different candidates or names given in the different philosophies, whether it be the Tao in the Chinese tradition, or Om, or Brahman in the Hindu tradition, or Shunyata, and so forth, that there was very much the need to have some primordial unified word that could serve as a candidate to show the deep common ground between these different primal names. And this is why I've gravitated to the logos.
Now, it's a Greek word.
Yes.
Why don't you define it?
Well, I think it has a number of connotations. That's part of its richness. It means word, it means speech, it means reason, it means language. So it has a rich multiplicity of connotations, which I think is its virtue as a candidate.
And it's a word that we find in the New Testament, as I recall.
Very much so. In John, it begins, in effect, that in the beginning is the logos, the word. So it's used in that religious sense as another name for the infinite word.
And there is a quality, when you use the term logos, of infinity to it.
Very much so. I think that's the very essence of this, because as a philosopher, when you go into the first philosophies, I mean, part of the perennial tradition is recognizing that whether you're in the Hindu tradition or the Buddhist tradition or the Greek classical tradition, philosophers have known and sensed that there must be a primal principle, a first principle, a primal form that holds things together and out of which you make sense. And I think the deepest meditations of the great minds have all recognized across cultures and worlds that this primal word must be infinite in its nature. It cannot be finitized. It cannot be objectified. So I would say that the most striking feature of this primal logos is its infinitude.
Well, it's an interesting feature because something infinite is almost by its very nature then non-physical. Everything physical is pretty much finite.
Well, that's a debatable point, because what I begin to see as I work across cultures and worlds, that you cannot approach the logos in ordinary everyday modes of thought. And I wasn't even aware until I got into some of the deep meditative traditions that there is such a thing as egocentric thinking or monocentric ways of conducting the mind, in which the ego or the self is seen as separate from the object of thought, And that way of thinking blocks the access to this fundamental logos. So I think that it's important in approaching the logos to realize that we have to attend to how we're conducting our minds. That's all important. And the meditative traditions, although they're very diverse, converge on the theme that unless you move beyond the ego barrier or the monocentric way of objectifying, you cannot access this fundamental logos.
So here you and I are having a conversation about the primal or fundamental principle of all existence. And if we try to engage in this conversation from the perspective of individual egos, I'm a separate person, you're a separate person, and now we're going to talk about this objective thing called the fundamental principle, what you're saying is we'll never get there.
That's right. And I think it therefore is important to become aware of the ego method of thinking as interfering and eclipsing the access to this fundamental logos. To pick up on the previous point, when you said that everyday things versus the logos tradition, if we can move into the appropriate methods of minding the logos, which the meditative traditions might call non-dual thinking, you begin to realize that the everyday objects, the mundane objects that we encounter, have a depth to them and a mystery to them, when engaged correctly, that the ordinary ego way of thinking blocks. So I think it's important to preserve, and I think in Zen experience, for example, entering the everyday moment, one crosses into a deeper way of being in time and space. And everything that appears to our consciousness in this awakened moment becomes sacred and deep and filled with infinitude.
Very much the way the poets have often written, such as Walt Whitman, that you can see God in every blade of grass.
Exactly right.
Grain of sand.
Right, and I think it's important, when I use the word meditative, people have connotations in our culture of sitting in silence and silencing the mind, which is correct. But there's a much richer, everyday sense of spontaneous meditation in which our natural intelligence crosses into this fundamental logos field. Athletes enter into that when they say they enter the zone, and they characteristically they leave the ego way of performing and find a much deeper, unified way of being in their performance. And I think poets, typically in their most inspired moments, enter and touch this logos power, and great poetry flows from that. Great artists, musical composers, and I think everyday people in their better moments, I would say, spontaneously touch into this fundamental logos.
You describe what you call the ego way of minding, the way we use our mind, or minding, as a technology that human civilization has developed over 5,000 years or so, and it served a certain purpose.
That's right. I think the word, I intentionally pick the word technology, because we usually, of course, think of technology as tools and things we make. But it's also a classical theme that human beings, in our thinking, make our worlds. We are world makers, we humans. We construct our worlds through our thinking. And in a way, the deepest and ultimate technology, the human technology, is through the conduct of our mind and world making. So yes, I think that the ego way of thinking is a stage in our maturation that is perhaps even genetic. It's so deep and pervasive across cultures and worlds that it has to be reckoned with.
One might think of it as the software with which we program our brain.
I'm thinking precisely analogous to that. Just as we have word processing in the computer technology and digital, I think quite precisely analogous to that is the method in which we are constructing and making our world and our experience. And so one of the deep perennial themes that emerges for me is recognizing that we humans are as we mind. So I use the word mind as a process that we engage in, and we construct our experience, we construct ourselves, we construct our worlds through the process of minding.
Now, the subtitle of your book, Meditative Reason, as I recall, is something akin to the search for a universal grammar.
Toward universal grammar.
Toward a universal grammar. And it reminds one, of course, of Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, who seemed to be discovering grammatical principles that were virtually physiological in nature and that seem to be the underpinnings of every human language. And some of those principles are the idea of subject, object, verb.
That's correct. And I think the word grammar has a linguistic sense. And I think Noam Chomsky is a good example, because he was trying to get at the deep structure of language. And he was relying on certain modern logical forms and logical structures to access that deep structure. But I'm using it in a classical sense. For me, grammar, universal grammar, from the very dawn of philosophy, East and West, there has been a quest to get at the fundamental code of that primal principle. It has a structure, so even though there's a linguistic sense of grammar, there's also a philosophical or logical sense. And logic as a science attempts to get at the grammar of thought. We recognize clearly that when we think and put ideas together, there are certain laws of thought that are operative. And so the grammatical structure of how we compose our world and think and predicate and combine subject and predicate is a grammar of its own. So I'm using it in the ontological and logical sense.
Well, it's interesting that we can, if we can go back and forth and play with this a little bit, the difference between the ontological and logical sense of grammar and the linguistic sense of grammar, I think is intriguing, because if Chomsky is correct that all languages are based on subject, verb, and object, then that in and of itself implies a kind of separation.
Yes.
That there's a duality, that we distinguish between the actor, the subject, me, and whatever else I'm manipulating or doing in the world, which is other than me.
That's a very good observation. I think I would add a prior point, however, that one of the deep tensions in contemporary European thinking that's behind Chomsky, that led to an impasse at the heart of linguistics in trying to get to this deep structure, is that there was a split in the logical tradition. That's important in my own evolution. When we realized that Aristotle's logic was a subject-predicate logic, and that Aristotle, who's considered the inventor or the founder of logic as a science, shaped the culture for centuries, because that was a fundamental grammar of thought out of which the culture emerged. But modern logic, coming out of Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein and these great innovators, went through such a revolution that they rejected the classical way of subject-predicate thinking and introduced a new mathematical way of understanding how the mind puts together subject and predicate in a different way. And unfortunately, I think Chomsky was relying on the modern mathematical logic as his main model and didn't understand that there was this deeper tradition that was subject, predicate, and form. That's a preliminary point I wanted to make.
Okay.
But your observation that the subject-predicate mode of thinking is problematic is exactly right. And what I discovered in my journey through these different logics, the early classical and the modern, is that they shared a dualistic structure. That ego-structured thinking, or I'd rather call it monocentric, because it's not just the ego that's in question, it's the whole way you process the world, has an object of thought that is typically divided into subject, predicate. And there's a split between the subject term and the predicate term, and that almost replicates the entire resonance of ego logic.
And for our viewers who may not know the meaning of the term predicate, it's something I think I learned in grammar long ago. It really means an object outside of oneself, does it not?
Not quite. It can mean that. It means that if the space of thinking is a subject and predicate and structure, predicate means the attribute. In Aristotle's way of putting it, when we think we have a subject like Socrates, and predicates or attributes like qualities, Socrates is wise, Socrates is a man, Socrates is Greek, so that there are two dimensions to composing of thinking, an object of thought and a predicate that characterizes or describes it in some way.
Okay.
So predicate then means the qualities and the relations and the various other attributes that belong to the subject.
I see.
But that is a signal of a split in the structure of our thinking, because when you try to understand the integrity of an entity, from the very dawn of philosophy, it was seen that, well, is there a subject apart from its attributes? It's obvious if you strip all the attributes from a subject, you have nothing. So that the subject must have attributes. But attributes are very different from subjects. And so there was a dualism right at the very start in the logical structure.
These kinds of problems have troubled philosophers for thousands of years. I know that some time ago I did an interview with David Chalmers, a philosopher who was explaining that one of the strategies philosophers have used to dismiss the classic mind-body dualism, the tension that exists as to how can mind itself have any kind of a physical basis, is they would say that the mind is an attribute of the brain, the way sharpness is an attribute of an axe.
Yes. I think that's right, and that attempt to use the subject predicate to understand the dualism of mind and brain, I find problematic. I think what you say, that for centuries, East and West, philosophers have struggled with a subject predicate structure. In yoga philosophy, for example, the whole meditative awakening of thought is seen that dualistic thinking in egocentric or monocentric thinking, subject predicate dualism, is the source of human suffering.
Yes.
And so the whole point of the yoga, the awakening to a deeper way of thinking, is to break the predicative subject-predicate barrier. And it's said that one of the second sutras of Patanjali is that the essence of yoga is quieting predication, quieting the dualistic split between subject and predicate, and the objectifying of thought of the subject thinking, of the objects of thought. When you objectify thinking, it leads to suffering in the deepest way. So this has been a problem all through the centuries.
Now, when we enter into what you refer to as the logos, or sometimes I think you would call it a dialogical consciousness, a consciousness of wholeness, of oneness, of non-duality and non-separation, immediately it would seem as if there might be problems trying to use human language at all, because all of human language is grounded in another way of being. So one is forced, I suppose, to be very creative or poetic in one's use of language.
Yes and no. You're quite right that from the egocentric point of view, language seems to be inherently dual. We want distinctions between subject and predicate. We want distinctions between you and me between me and any object in the world. We want to preserve that. So it seems as if our world has distinctions. By its very nature, it seems that language is dual. But what's remarkable about the meditative traditions, again, which has really nourished me in this way, is that they show strategies for overcoming the dualistic way of thinking and processing language and moving into what's considered a unitive or relational or non-dual way of using language. So it's not, and metaphors play an important role in mythical transformation in awakening the mind. But I would like to preserve the possibility of a deeper kind of language that is not dualistic.
In other words, it sounds as if what you're saying is that the language must serve the consciousness from which it originates rather than constrain consciousness.
Exactly, exactly. And so that's why I come back to the theme that how we're thinking is all important. And if we're thinking in a monocentric, objectifying, subject-predicate, dualizing way, we're blocking the deeper power of language. And so what for me, in terms of meditative reason, is a breakthrough, is that we tend to think of reason as dualistic. And I think the great minds, certainly in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha's rational awakening and enlightenment was breaking that egocentric barrier, seeing that as a source of all suffering, and realizing that there's a way of thinking that is non-dual, and it does involve language, but not in this dualistic way.
Well, there are paradoxes in here. It seems to me, I recall one lecture in which the authority was saying, well, the fundamental of all mysticism is to eliminate the ego, and yet well, we couldn't walk, we couldn't drive, we couldn't work without some ego functioning, and there is a sense in which people who are awakened to a mystical awareness, to the logos, or a dialogical awareness, as you call it, they have a very strong sense of self, a strong sense maybe of higher self, of a self without boundaries, but it's not as if they are egoless in the at least in one way in which we use the word ego.
I think that's a very powerful point. And for example, when you go into meditative experience, it's very clear, if there's such a thing as non-dual experience that is not splitting up the world, that there still is distinction in this unified field of meditative thinking. The basic intuition of the meditative traditions is that if there is, and there must be, a primal form, and it's infinite, that it is so powerful that it holds everything within its sphere. And this means that there cannot be any atomic entities that are separable. It means that all entities are interactive, interrelational, and therefore, as the Buddhists would say, co-arising. And that's relational. And relation implies distinction. So it's very important to see, in crossing from the dualistic way of thinking to the awakened non-dual mystical, I would like to demystify it in a way, and yet save the mystery, that there is distinction without dualism. So for example, an example I use with my students, imagine a runner who is struggling in an ego way to run and to be an excellent runner. And she tries over and over for months and months running, very conscious of I am running and I am moving and so forth. And one afternoon, unbeknownst to her, unplanned, she just starts running. I use double brackets to signal the meditative experience rather than a single way of indicating ego thinking. And imagine in double brackets a runner who is so deep involved in the running that she is the running, she is the time, she is the breath, she is the moving. There really is distinction. She's not fumbling and falling. She is not the ground, but she is in a unitive relational way of being with it that allows a more efficient and fluid way of proceeding in action.
So there is a sense that losing the ego isn't necessarily losing one's control. It's rather gaining a higher level, a more optimal level of functioning by identifying with the flow, with the whole.
Exactly, and I think the way you just put it was quite striking. That once we realize that the ego is not the same as the self, it is a stage in becoming a self, and it's a constructed artificial entity that we create in our predications. And realize that there are techniques that have been developed for centuries of stepping beyond that artificial structure. That the real self is a profound, fluid process. So that there is a powerful sense of self that arises in meditative awareness. And there are distinctions. So I call it dialogical, as Buber would, when he speaks of the I-it versus the I-thou. That there really is an other.
Yeah. Now here you're referring to the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber.
Yes, in his well-known book I and Thou, he attempts to distinguish between two ways in which human beings have technologies of being. One is an I-it, in which you are an object. The other is an object, which is not dialogical and relational. And a different one that seems to be so mysterious and hard to process, which he called an I-thou. And as he brilliantly develops that, the I-thou is an immediate encounter. You're not an object. We are partners in a mutual encounter.
It's sort of recognizing the shared essence that we both have.
Exactly. So there is you and me, and there's difference. So that's to me, one of the most difficult points to process through the ages of perennial philosophy, is realizing that there are different kinds of relation. There's a dualistic, objectifying relation, but then there's a distinction that is in a mutuality. Of a me encountering a thou.
Now, one of the points that you bring out is that all human ailments, war, conflict, alienation, the way in which people oppress each other seem to result from the ego-based consciousness and not the dialogical or logos consciousness.
Yes, and I come to that by really working through the various traditions of philosophy, East and West. I think that's deep in the Western European tradition as well as in the Eastern traditions. For example, you find at the heart of the Hindu tradition of philosophy, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, where this is now the classical Hindu scripture, where it's a classic epic in which a great warrior, Arjuna, is on the battlefield in a battle of the family, a family split. And he reaches a point in his life as a great hero warrior where he cannot proceed in this battle. He sees his own family. And the external split replicates the inner split in himself, which comes, he doesn't know yet, from ego awareness and the ego way of thinking. And his charioteer, who happens to be Krishna, and we should all have Krishna as our charioteer, the incarnation of Vishnu, the divine incarnation, begins to take him through a therapy of awakening to show him that he has been ego thinking, and to begin to see, in a way he couldn't before, that the way he thinks is at the source of his despair and the breakdown of his life.
But the paradox here, to me, is that the ego thinking in him wants to put down his weapon and walk away from the battlefield, and whereas the higher awakening leads him to pick up his bow and arrow and enter into the fray of the battle. That seems very odd from a culture that has given us the whole concept of nonviolence.
Yes, I would rather say that when Arjuna, and this is typical, Arjuna is a hero who represents all human beings, the ego person, where she reaches a crisis point in her life where she cannot function. Her life splits and breaks, indicating that there's a split in the ego self. The self is, but that recognition and maturing of the crisis of life comes from the higher voice coming through. It was because Arjuna felt this higher conscience that he paused a moment on the battlefield and saw, my ethic, which is to enter war at all costs, is not right. So it really is the deeper conscience, what we might call the conscience. It's breaking through of this higher self that is now calling for this important awakening.
Well, the story suggests to me, and of course we'll have a chance to explore this more in part 2 of this 2-part series, but that the struggle between the ego consciousness and the higher dialogical awakening, the enlightened mind, the higher self, that this struggle, this dialectic between the two of them is an important part of human process. And there's a sense, for me at least, in which the higher mind isn't complete without the ego.
I think that's quite accurate, that the human situation, if we have an enriched understanding of our human situation, I think we have to see that facing the deepest struggles with the ego presence and the higher self, and the dialogue between these two, and the dialectic, as you say, is really at the heart of the human condition.
Yes. Well, Ashok Gangadine, what a pleasure to be with you. I'm really enjoying the richness of this conversation and the way we're able to tease out some of the nuances of the meditative tradition, integrate it with our understanding of language and grammar and logic, and thus make it more real for the Western trained people in our audience. Thank you for being with me.
It's a pleasure to share these thoughts with you.
And thank you for being with us, and do check your program listings for part 2 of this 2-part series on the awakening of the global mind.
Partial funding for Thinking Aloud is provided by the Intuition Network, helping to create a world where people feel encouraged to rely upon their inner intuitive resources.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 2-part series on awakening the global mind. With me is Professor Ashok Gangadine, who is chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Haverford College in Haverford, Pennsylvania. Dr. Gangadine is also the director of the Global Dialogue Institute, and he is the author of several books, including Meditative Reasoning, Between Worlds, and Awakening of the Global Mind. Welcome again, Ashok.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. In part 1 of this 2-part series, we discussed the basic premise of all of the great spiritual traditions and philosophical traditions, and really quite a bit of the scientific traditions as well, that there's a single unifying principle underlying all of reality, and expressed both through science and religion.
Yes. And we use the word logos to indicate that, and I try to explain why it's so vital, especially now in our cultural evolution, to have a powerful candidate, a name that can help us to realize a classical intuition across cultures and worlds that there must be a fundamental principle. Otherwise, culture couldn't work, experience couldn't work, the self couldn't be a self without this fundamental unifying principle.
And logos itself is a very interesting word. It's a Greek word that is sometimes taken simply to mean word, and yet it means something much more than that. You equate it really with what you would call a logos consciousness, a consciousness of unity, a consciousness of source.
Yes,
consciousness of essence.
Right, and I think the different traditions have all recognized that human reason, our capacity to make sense of the world, to find things intelligible, to have the lights on in our mind, must come from this unifying force. So I think that the word logos does have that connotation. We should also see that all of our sciences, philology, psychology, all have the logos word. So it's deep in the idea of science itself, giving an account of. So I think that the word logos has all of these rich connotations.
In fact, one of the loveliest sentences I read in your book talks about how even the skeptics of the logos, who might be positivists or the deconstructionists, or people who would say, oh, there is no essence, it's all our projection, or we can't know what it is, what you suggest is without this logos, without this essence, well, there would be no possibility of consciousness at all.
Exactly, and that's a very classical theme. I mean, philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, for example, not to mention Shankara and other, Nagarjuna. It's so obvious and simple that if there is not a unifying power, our words could not cohere, our thoughts could not come together and join to form intelligible thoughts. We as thinkers would have no coherence to think. So that the skeptic who would say that there is no logos or no unifying principle is in the deepest self-contradiction, because she would not be able to think and speak and use words without this logos.
Mm-hmm.
And Aristotle saw something like that, that if you try to deny the ultimate first principle, you show want of education.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the statement by one of the great scientists, Sir James Jeans, looking at the field of science when he said, "Scientists are very funny. They seem to all be animated by the purpose of showing that there is no purpose."
Yes, that's right. And I think that this logos, however you try to move around it, it reaffirms itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the traditions, what's remarkable, is that the traditions of what's called first philosophy. In the previous discussion we talked about perennial philosophy, which really means that across cultures and worlds there are fundamental truths.
Mm-hmm.
And that perennial tradition recognizes that there are global truths, truths that are valid across cultures and worlds and across disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Now, it seems as when we look at the history of philosophy in general, that philosophers everywhere are struggling to grasp, to put into language this first principle. The earliest Greeks debated whether it was fire or water or air or ice. There are other philosophers, the Buddhists, who say, well, it's really nothingness at all. That's the essence of it. And today we have quantum physicists saying, yes, but the vacuum state is the most alive, most vital form of nothingness.
Yes.
From it can emerge the Big Bang. You point out that this logos it has certain qualities, qualities of infinitude. It partakes of infinity and qualities of relationship or relationality, I think is the term you use.
Yes.
So that when we look culturally at all of these diverse ways of describing the first creative principle, the source of everything, it would make sense. One would expect to see very diverse descriptions of it.
Yes, and one of the points you began with is that if you say, for example, look at the Chinese attempt to get at this first principle in the Tao. One of the first formulas is that the Tao that can be spoken is not the Tao. It is a paradox, it seems, of a nameless name. When you try to get to the ultimate first principle, it breaks the barrier of everyday language. Ordinary names can't apply. The ordinary modes of thinking don't work. And this has been seen across traditions. Plato saw it in the highest level of consciousness in the Republic, the great classic. He saw that the mind must reach in its rational maturing to rational enlightenment, an ultimate intuition into goodness as a universal form of all forms that's deeper than the forms out of which all the forms arise. This is seen in the Om principle, in the Shunyata principle, as you pointed out. So to enter into an encounter with this primal first, it is recognized that it cannot be finitized, it cannot be objectified, it's infinite.
Now let me
And
recap for a second. You
Yes.
used the word shunyata principle, and for the benefit of our viewers, I should say that's a Buddhist term for nothingness.
Yes, it is. I was picking up on your word,
Yes.
reference to absolute nothingness, because the Buddha saw that ego thinking constructs objects that leads to suffering. And his greatest insight was that we can break the ego barrier. We can step back from the ego construction and become a real self. And in an ironic way, it's letting go of the self in this constructed sense. And shunyata is a recognition. It means zero, literally in the Sanskrit. But it's a device to get us to see that you cannot lay a name and identify a name and objectify this fundamental principle. So therapeutically, to think of it as shunyata, absolute emptiness, which of course means absolute richness and fullness, in its infinitude, is what shunyata is attempting to bring out.
Mm-hmm. And you even equate this with the God of the Hebrews as well.
Yes, I think
who has a real personality.
This is a general point as I struggle with theology and the language of theology. And in our earlier discussion, we talked about the two ways in which the mind has been functioning in the human evolution: the egocentric way, or the monocentric way that objectifies thinking and causes dualism, and the way that I would speak of entering the logos language, a logos script or technology, which the meditative turn in awareness, or awakened mind, gains access to. If you attempt to understand the language of God, or the divine word, or scripture, and you attempt to place it in the objectified ego structure of thinking, it just doesn't work. And therefore, in my own experiments across cultures, whether you have God talk or first principle, it needn't be God. That divine scripture must be processed in this logos language. And as you know, I use double brackets to signal when the mind is entering into this unified, interactive mode of thought that is encountering the logos space.
Now, when you refer to your experiments, as I understand it, you're really talking about 30 years in the classroom working with students.
Yes, I've been teaching, this is my 30th year of teaching philosophy at Haverford, and it goes back even to a graduate student before that when I was at Brandeis, working experimentally through different traditions, different worldviews, different cultural, religious traditions. I consider that experimentation in the first degree.
Indeed, and to me there's a sense in which when you are working with students, you're dealing with people who maybe 20 years ago were infants.
Yes.
They were born with a kind of logos awareness, a sense of the oceanic oneness of everything, according to Freud. Then as they grow up, they are taught to distinguish subject from object, to separate themselves from their mother, for example, to develop an ego. It's part of growing up, and they reach into the college years, and part of your work is reawakening a higher awareness that they once had before they were acculturated.
Yes, I think that's exactly correct. It's amazing. It's been a classical theme, as you know, when we speak of the child as father to the man. I mean, that children are born with a spontaneous access to this deeper self. And tragically, I think, when we begin to step back and look at the spectrum of human evolution and our present culture, it's remarkable how much of our culture is steeped in egocentric structures and patterns and inveterate habits of thought, which the great minds have seen has been the source of suffering.
Yes.
And what is tragic, I think, is that we are not still, after all these centuries of the teaching being available, of what the consequences of ego thinking, that we raise our children in our culture, when we recreate them in our cultural image, in our educational methods, we steep them in ego ways of thinking, which block access to this deeper logos that is spontaneously there.
But it is necessary to train a child, for example, to tie their shoes.
Yes, but you see, I think that imagine a culture in which what comes with that, when we do it in an egoized way, where the child begins to develop this, you're right, there's a normal sense, a stage of maturation in which one takes oneself to be an ego, and you can objectify yourself. But if you get stuck there, and if the culture gets stuck there, and we steep into our consciousness as we raise our children, our youth, to objectify herself and objects of the world, there's a disastrous consequence of that. And it need not be. It seems to me that the great teachers have shown it's possible to raise our children to be aware of this fundamental logos in everyday life.
You point out that the great traditions suggest that all human suffering, war, crime, alienation, the oppression of people, economic suffering, is all at base due to this kind of me first selfishness, ego generated awareness.
Well, yes, I would make it even more generic, Jeffrey. That's why, in a way, I step back from the word ego, because ego to us sounds as if it's just egocentric. But I would rather call it monocentric, in the sense that egocentric thinking is one example of monocentric thought patterns, where the self objectifies its world, and it takes its worldview to be the ultimate measure of reality. What we have not seen sufficiently is when we are in this monocentric, self-absolutizing mode and practice, we've blocked the access to the other, and we block the access to ourselves. And the great teachers have seen, it's the essence of Buddhism, for example, that when we're in that pattern, it generates the deepest splits within ourselves and in our environment, and that inevitably leads to violence of all sorts.
Well, the Buddhists were very good at the doctrine of no self.
Yes.
At all. I think it's called anatta.
Yes, anatta, which means Atman is the self, anatta is the no self.
The no self.
A philosophy.
And even cognitive psychologists these days would say that the self is nothing more than a cognition that we create.
Yes, but I think it's important to realize that in the Buddhist strategy of breaking this circuit and inveterate habit of ego-selfing by saying no self, that what happens is that upon awakening, the self is a dynamic process. And certain great philosophers like Whitehead, as you know, began to see that we can move beyond objectifying substances. The self is not a substance. And things are not substances, they're dynamic processes. So when we, in terms of cognition, the Buddha's great awakening is coming to cognitive awareness. So meditative awareness, and I call it meditative reason, meditative awakening, enters into deeper cognition, a deeper way of knowing the world.
You know, I once had lunch with the philosopher U.G. Krishnamurti, whom I've interviewed in the past, and over lunch he began, as he was cooking the lunch for us, explained to me that as far as he was concerned there was nobody there inside. He said, you know, as I look at myself, there's nothing, I'm nobody.
Yes.
Do you feel that way?
Well, I would qualify that because, and this is why I want to retain a strong sense of self. And I think it's very compatible with the Buddhist enlightenment and Buddhist awakening, even though there's a no-self theory. Because I take that to be a deconstruction, a therapeutic way of blocking us from clinging to a self. But what comes out of the awakening is a selfing, a process. And I would rather say that, I'll give you an example. One of the Olympic runners, just after she performed and just broke the world record, she was being interviewed. And she was describing the feeling. And she said it was the greatest feeling in her life when she runs, because she's not there. So running and that being in the zone is breaking the ego barrier, and you have a heightened sense of self-awareness, but there is no self, no ego.
At that moment.
At that moment.
But then later on, now she's won her gold medal. Don't you suppose she comes
that
back and it
inevitably,
reinforces?
yes, exactly. That is the pattern. I mean, we have episodes of awakening, and the strategy is: can we really cultivate a culture in which we can be this more awakened self that is not egoizing, and can live our culture and relate to one another in this more awakened way?
It seems as if there are traps involved. One Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, called it, as I recall, spiritual materialism, where we have an awakening of sorts, and then we use that as almost as an adornment on the ego.
Yes, and the traditions are very watchful of, for example, you don't objectify the Buddha, you don't objectify the teaching, you don't objectify shunyata. So it's very clear in a kind of self-cancellation therapy that if you say you're enlightened, that's a good sign that you're not, and that it's an ongoing, deep, creative process that's ongoing. It's not a finished production.
So in a way, we all live, as you write, between the worlds.
Yes. What I'm intending to bring out in that title of the book, Between Worlds, is really that there must be a fundamental logos that connects our different worlds that we live in. But as we saw in the previous conversation, that our human situation is that we're living between these two profound fields, the ego-centered culture, which is one field or one world, and the awakened space of the logos. And we live out our lives in between these spaces or fields or forces.
To me, that feels very comfortable, to think that there's simultaneously an ego awareness and an awareness of oneness.
Yes, and I think that one of the struggles of these traditions, of the Logos philosophies, as I would say, is to recognize that when we are in our awakened, non-dual, unified relational mode, the dialogical mode, that we may have lost the ego sense, and we've gained a more profound and enriched sense of our individuality. That was one of the most difficult things for me to realize, that meditative awakening doesn't mean giving up distinction. It doesn't mean giving up your autonomy. It doesn't mean giving up your sense of self. And so there really remains distinctions in this awakened mode.
In fact, it would seem to me that by some standards, the awakened mind is capable of making far more distinctions. The most enlightened people I know are ones who can describe in great detail, for example, the flavors, the subtle flavors of food that they might be eating.
Yes, and this is a signature of being awakened to the Logos, because, as we said earlier, if the Logos, a space in which we become awakened, is the infinite power, that infinitude in its unifying force is the source of all diversity. So one of the greatest insights, I think, across the cultures is realizing that the profound unity of this Logos doesn't reduce and block pluralism and multiplicity and diversity and individuality, but is the very source of it. So the distinctions flourish in this awakened mind.
So there, from the egotistic or egoistic or ego consciousness point of view, there are many things that seem paradoxical about spiritual awakening, my sense is from listening to you that from the Logos consciousness, these paradoxes are resolved.
Yes. For example, one of the greatest paradoxes of awakening from the ego, as we know across traditions, is if the ego sees itself as this ultimate being with its own identity. And the teaching of awakening is saying you need to let go of that and surrender and give it up. One immediate existential paradox is, how can the ego let go of itself? How can it's a kind of suicide. It's letting go of its identity. Yeah. It faces the terror of a kind of death to let go, and that it has a ring of a paradox. On the other hand, in entering into the awakened awareness, what one sees in another strange twist, and it comes out in Zen, the koan, where there's a kind of living paradox, is that it's not that the world is demystified, but oppositions and splits in the ego consciousness are found to meet and be inseparable in the awakened mind. For example, that the space and time unite in a profound way in the Logos awakening. Mind and body are found to be inseparable. So you have mind-body. And the Zen are very infamous for pointing out that when one is awakened to the infinitude of the moment, which is awakened life, that every moment is living dying. To be the most heightened form of living is to experience the passage and a great dying, so that it's living dying. So that sounds like another kind of paradox at a deeper level.
In part one of this interview, we began to talk about the great Hindu epic, the Bhagavad Gita, and the relationship between the ego consciousness of the warrior Arjuna and the enlightened awakening that he was brought to through the instruction of his charioteer Krishna.
Yes.
And we discussed the paradoxes within paradoxes in this awakening, that as he became fully awakened, he felt comfortable going into battle. When he was caught in the ego state, he was uncomfortable fighting. The comfort with the battle, as I recall, is because he realized that life and death don't even exist from the point of view of this higher consciousness, that there were higher values than life and death.
Yes. The way I would put it is in the epic, the metaphoric layers of the Bhagavad Gita, as Arjuna goes through the awakening and Krishna leads him, you do go through levels of paradoxes, and Arjuna is brilliant, an excellent student. He's a good prototypical student of philosophy, asking the right questions and challenging Krishna to be more specific and not to give him contradictions and so forth along the way. But when Arjuna reaches a maturity of this awakening therapy, and his Logos perspective is opened up, reality is disclosed in a profoundly different way than it was before. And as you say, the battle that he began with, the metaphor of the battle, turns out to be the inner spiritual battle. And Krishna shows him that every human being has to face the battle of the ego vis-a-vis the higher self. And so we are all warriors. And if we can go through this awakening process, that we enter life. So picking up the weapon is not a militaristic, violent act of entering into the battle. That's not the point. Picking up the weapon is affirming life in this new way and going on with your life.
Yes.
And in that sense, there's and the martial arts attempt to do that.
In other words, living life with courage.
Exactly, exactly the point.
Living life with heart and fulfilling one's duties and obligations.
Exactly, in a wholehearted way. Living as a unified, integral being, you become integral and integrated, and your splits are healed at that point. So that the injunction, and really another conversation we could speak of, why this is nonviolent. Why one can live one's life in a non-violent way.
Well, I'd also like to come back to another phrase in the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna reveals himself as the incarnation of the deity, of Vishnu. The phrase is used that he shone brighter than 10,000 suns.
Yes.
And there is a sense of the awesomeness there of the higher consciousness.
Absolutely, that's infinite light, and it's also dangerous. I mean, we have to be prepared and capacitated by stages of awakening. Plato said this beautifully too, because when we reach the ultimate form of goodness, which is the source of all light, it can be blinding. And as Plato said in the allegory of the cave, that when you leave the cave of darkness into the light, you have to be prepared, or the light can blind you. So that there's a long tradition of the awakened mind having to be prepared and capacitated to process entering into this presence of the infinitude and the infinite light.
There is a sense amongst the Sufi teachers that it is one of the greatest sins of a teacher is to try and enlighten a student before that student is ready.
Very much so, and that's a classical tradition across the traditions. In the Hindu tradition, for example, Nagarjuna recognizes that this is dangerous teaching and high-powered, and like a serpent wrongly grasped, you know, it has to be handled correctly. So it has to be done with great competence and skill and responsibility.
So when you write of the awakening of the global mind, there is also a sense that our culture cannot just all of a sudden wake up.
Absolutely, yes.
We must as well do it in stages.
And the wonderful thing, Jeffrey, is that we have a wealth of traditions that have of great teachings for centuries that have, in each of the cultures, shown the ways in which we can awaken and capacitate the mind to this higher rational enlightenment. And we have to proceed with that in a very responsible way.
See, there's a paradox. Of course, the phrase brighter than 10,000 suns was also used by the atomic physicist Robert Oppenheimer to describe the first nuclear explosion.
Yes. I'm not surprised because, of course, in terms of this logos, we realize, and this could be another conversation, that the sciences, and certainly physics has been paramount in opening up the path into the unified field and trying to tap the ways of getting into this continuum of the unified field of reality. And so whether we talk about the high energy of black holes or whatever the metaphors are, there is a respect in that language for the profundity of this original energy.
Yes. Well, we're running out of time, and we've been dealing with some very deep issues, the tension of the human being between the ego self, the small self, the me, and that larger consciousness, the consciousness of wholeness, of oneness with everything, and the sense that we as individuals need to awaken always, and yet do it in a way which is compatible, conducive with where we are now. It's almost like being transformed without being transformed.
Yes, and the theme of the awakening of the global mind, I try to give that story of how culture is reaching a very exciting moment, where it's not just only individuals, but there is a corporate evolution that we're in the midst of that is lifting us up at this stage after painful evolution into this global awakening, or entering into the Logos together.
And it's very exciting to be living in a time where these kinds of discussions can take place on public media and in corporate circles.
Very much so. Very much so.
This is a discussion that used to be relegated only to a very esoteric circle.
Yes, and the wonderful signs of this is the recognition in the culture of people having spiritual needs. And a new spirituality in business and corporate awakening, for example. It's beginning to flourish, and it's really across the culture.
Well, Ashok Gangadeen, what a pleasure to be with you and to share these 2 half-hour discussions.
I really enjoyed speaking with you and sharing these thoughts.
Thanks so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.